wind howled through the skeletal branches of the trees, rattling against the windows of the old university dormitory. Inside, the air buzzed with excitement as a group of students packed their bags, their minds filled with anticipation for the long-awaited trip. December had finally arrived, bringing with it the promise of adventure, freedom, and an escape from the suffocating weight of final exams. Among them were 6 friends: Dara, Malik, Femi, Oyen, Tund, and Chioma. They had planned this trip for months, eager to visit a remote countryside resort that promised breathtaking scenery and absolute seclusion. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway, a well-earned reward for their hard work throughout the semester. Dara, the most superstitious of the group, hesitated at the doorway, her fingers clutching the small, worn-out Bible her grandmother had given her. "We should pray before we leave," she murmured, glancing nervously at her friends. Malik, always the skeptic, rolled his eyes. "Come on, Dara. It's just a road trip, not a mission to the underworld. You never know," she insisted. "December is strange. My grandmother always said it's the time when spirits roam freely, looking for lost souls." Oyen laughed, tossing her long braids over her shoulder. "Your grandma also said whistling at night invites the dead. And look, we're still alive." The others chuckled, brushing off Dara's fears. But deep down, something about her words unsettled them. Still, no one wanted to be the one to ruin the mood. So, they piled into the rented bus, their laughter echoing in the crisp winter air as they drove off into the unknown. The road stretched endlessly before them, winding through dense forests that seemed to whisper secrets to the wind. The sky, once a bright blue, had darkened prematurely, thick clouds rolling in like a shroud. Chioma glanced at the GPS. "It says we should reach the resort in 2 hours. But why does it feel like we've been driving forever?" Tund, who was at the wheel, frowned. "That's weird. I swear I haven't taken a wrong turn." A heavy silence settled over them. The music playing softly from the radio crackled before cutting out entirely. Static filled the air, followed by a faint whisper, something barely audible but unmistakably there. "What the hell was that?" Femi asked, reaching for the radio dial. A burst of distorted noise erupted from the speakers, like 100 voices speaking at once, layered over a chilling, high-pitched wail. Then, as suddenly as it started, the radio went dead. The group sat frozen, their breaths caught in their throats. "It's just interference," Malik said, though his voice wavered slightly. Dara clenched her Bible. "We should turn back." "No way," Tund said, forcing a grin. "We've come too far to chicken out now." Reluctantly, they pressed on. The deeper they drove, the more unnatural the surroundings became. The trees seemed taller, their branches curling like skeletal fingers. The road, once paved, had turned to a rough, uneven path. Fog began to rise, thick and suffocating, swallowing their headlights whole. Then they saw it, a woman dressed in white, standing in the middle of the road. Her back was turned to them, her long, jet-black hair swaying gently as if caught in an invisible breeze. Tund slammed on the brakes. "What the?" Oyen began, but her words died in her throat as the woman slowly turned. Her face was pale, her eyes black voids that seemed to stretch into endless darkness. Her lips curled into an unnatural smile, revealing teeth too sharp, too long. And then she took a step forward. The engine sputtered and died. The lights flickered, plunging them into near darkness. The last thing they heard before everything went silent was a whisper, soft, almost melodic. "You should have prayed." A deathly silence filled the van, thick and suffocating, as if the air itself had been drained from the atmosphere. The woman in white stood motionless in the road, her soulless black eyes locked onto them. Her mouth remained twisted into that grotesque grin, her 2 long teeth glinting in the dim light. Inside the van, no one dared to speak, no one dared to breathe. The weight of an unseen force pressed down on them, paralyzing their bodies with fear. Then a sharp tapping on the windshield. Tund let out a choked gasp, his hands clenching the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The tapping came again, louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't the woman's fingers. No, it was her tongue. A long, blackened, decayed tongue, slithering across the glass like a snake, leaving behind a trail of thick, dark slime. Owen screamed. That single sound shattered the spell of stillness. "Drive!" Dara shrieked, clutching her Bible to her chest. Tund twisted the key in the ignition, but the van refused to start. The engine coughed and sputtered as if something inside it was being strangled. Outside, the woman's head tilted unnaturally to the side, her movements jerky and puppet-like. Her shoulders began to shake. A laugh? No, it was something worse. The sound that came from her lips was a low, guttural gurgle, like a drowning person gasping for air. Then, she rushed at them. Her body slammed against the hood of the van with inhuman force, her black nails clawing at the windshield, leaving deep, jagged scratches. The glass began to crack. Tund turned the key again. Nothing. Then, without warning, the radio crackled back to life, playing a distorted, warped version of a hymn. "Nearer, my God, to thee." And the woman's smile vanished. She froze, her head snapping up as if hearing something they couldn't. Her black eyes flickered with something. Fear? Recognition? Then, with a final hiss, she stepped backward and melted into the fog. The van roared to life. Tund didn't waste a second. He slammed his foot onto the gas, tires screeching as they sped away into the dense mist. Nobody spoke for a long time. The only sound was the labored breathing of 6 terrified students and the hum of the van's engine. Chioma was the first to break the silence. "Tell me someone else saw that," she whispered. "Saw it?" Malik's voice was hoarse. "She was about to rip our faces off." Oyen hugged her knees to her chest. "Dara was right," she murmured. "We should have prayed." Dara didn't respond. She just stared out of the window, clutching her Bible as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. Femi, who had been eerily quiet this whole time, finally spoke. "Guys, something's wrong?" They all turned to look at him. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he held up his phone. The screen displayed the GPS. "We've been driving for 3 hours." "What?" Tund asked. "That's impossible." Chioma grabbed her own phone and checked the time. He was right. It had been 3 hours since they fled from the woman in white. 3 hours of driving straight. And yet the GPS still showed them in the same location. The road on the map looped endlessly, as if they were trapped in a maze with no way out. A chill slithered down Dara's spine. "This isn't real. This road isn't real." Oyen let out a nervous laugh, though it held no humor. "We're being messed with, right? This is some kind of prank." Then, the headlights flickered, and the van stopped moving. Not because Tund hit the brakes, but because something outside had stopped it. A deep, resonant sound filled the air, a low, guttural groan, like the earth itself was waking up. The fog around them grew thicker, curling against the windows like ghostly fingers. And then, through the dense mist, they saw them. Figures. Dozens. Hundreds. Men, women, and children stood along the roadside, their faces twisted into expressions of pure agony. Their eyes were hollow, empty sockets, and their mouths hung open as if caught mid-scream. They weren't moving. They weren't alive, but they were watching, waiting. Tund's breath hitched. "Oh God." Then from behind them, a voice whispered, soft, melodic, and familiar. "You should have prayed." The voice slithered through the air like a whisper carried on the wind, wrapping itself around their spines and sending shivers through their bodies. "You should have prayed." Dara's breath caught in her throat. She knew that voice. Slowly, she turned her head toward the back of the van, dread pooling in her stomach like ice-cold lead. The others followed her gaze, their movements slow, stiff, afraid of what they might see. There, sitting in the last row of seats, was Femi. But Femi was also sitting in the front passenger seat. The Femi in the front seat was gripping his phone tightly, his breathing heavy and erratic. His face was slick with sweat, and his hands trembled as he gripped his seatbelt. But the Femi in the back, his head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if his neck had been twisted too far. His lips stretched into a grin that was too wide, too unnatural. And his eyes, pure black, empty voids that sucked in all the light around them. Femi, Malik stammered. The thing in the back of the van let out a low chuckle. It was Femi's voice, yet not his voice. It was layered, distorted, like many voices speaking at once. "I warned you," it said, its black eyes gleaming. "But none of you listened." Oyen let out a sharp scream and scrambled toward the van door, her hands fumbling for the handle. But the moment her fingers touched it, the lock clicked shut. The doors wouldn't open. The van wouldn't move. They were trapped. The engine groaned and sputtered, the dashboard lights flickering like a dying heartbeat. And then outside, the figures moved. Not all at once. No, it was slow, jerky, like marionettes whose strings were being yanked by an unseen force. Their hollow eyes remained locked on the van, their lips trembling, their bodies convulsing as if something inside them was trying to crawl out. One by one, their mouths opened, and they screamed, a sound so horrific, so unnatural, that it shattered the last remnants of sanity inside the van. Dara clapped her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just external. It was inside their heads, burrowing into their skulls, scraping against their bones. Malik doubled over, vomiting onto the van floor. Chioma was sobbing, rocking back and forth. Tun was still gripping the wheel, his eyes wide, unfocused, as if he was no longer in control of his own body. And then, the van began to shake. The figures outside were slamming their hands against the windows, their bony fingers clawing at the glass, leaving behind streaks of something dark and viscous. The glass cracked. The entire van was tilting, as if being lifted. And the Femi thing in the backseat? It was laughing. Dara squeezed her eyes shut. Pray, pray, pray. She forced herself to remember the prayers her mother had taught her. The words tumbled from her lips, shaky and desperate. He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. The moment the words left her mouth, the screaming outside stopped. The pounding against the windows ceased. The van was suddenly still. Dara's eyes snapped open. The figures were gone. The road ahead was clear. The mist had thinned, revealing a single path winding into the unknown. The Femi thing's smile faded. Its black eyes narrowed. "You're ruining the fun," it hissed, its voice warping. Dara didn't stop praying. She spoke louder, firmer, calling on every ounce of faith she had left. The Femi thing let out a guttural growl. Its skin began to crack, dark veins spreading across its face like splintered glass. Then it let out a shriek, a sound of pure, unfiltered rage. The shadows around it rippled, twisting violently, like something being ripped out of existence. And then it vanished. Gone. No trace of it remained. Femi, the real Femi, gasped as if he had been drowning and finally reached the surface. His body sagged, his eyes rolling back as he collapsed against the seat, unconscious. The van's engine roared back to life. Tun's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. He didn't question it. He didn't hesitate. He slammed his foot on the gas, and the van sped forward. For several minutes, no one spoke. The road stretched before them, no longer looping, no longer endless. And then up ahead they saw it, a signpost. It was old, rusted, barely standing, but the words on it were clear. Welcome to Alika, a town, a real place, a way out. Relief crashed over them in waves, but it was fragile, brittle, because they all knew. This wasn't over. Something had let them go, but it hadn't forgotten them, and it never would. The van rumbled down the winding road, its tires kicking up dust as it approached Alika. The sign had been rusted, nearly unreadable, yet the town it pointed to was unmistakably real. Or at least, it looked real. Dara clutched the edge of her seat, her fingers digging into the fabric as they drove into the town's outskirts. The street was eerily quiet, lined with old houses and streetlights that flickered weakly against the growing darkness. No people, no movement, just silence. It was as if the entire town was waiting for something. Tun brought the van to a slow stop in front of what looked like an old gas station. The single flickering light above the pump barely illuminated the space, casting eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. No one stepped out of the van at first. No one spoke. They were still shaken. The thing that had worn Femi's face was gone, but its presence still lingered like a sickness in the air. Then, Oyen broke the silence. We should ask for help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe someone lives here. Maybe they can—" "No." Femi's voice was hoarse but firm. He was still pale, his body visibly trembling, but there was fear in his eyes. "Femi, we don't have much of a choice," Chioma said, her voice gentle but urgent. "We need gas. We need to know where we are. We need to leave." Femi's voice cracked. He swallowed hard and looked at them, his wide, terrified eyes scanning each of their faces. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I know this place." Dara's breath hitched. "What?" Femi swallowed. His hands curled into fists. "This town, it doesn't exist anymore." The word sent a chill down everyone's spine. "What do you mean it doesn't exist?" Malik asked, his voice shaking. Femi licked his dry lips, his gaze darting toward the empty streets. He was shaking, but not from the cold. "My grandmother was from Alika," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She used to tell me stories about it. About what happened here." Tund inhaled sharply. "Femi, what are you talking about?" Femi's hands trembled as he wrapped his arms around himself. His voice was tight, strained. "This town," he hesitated. "It burned down. Over 30 years ago. There was an accident, a gas explosion. It wiped out everything. Everyone." Chioma let out a shaky laugh, one that held no real humor. "That doesn't make any sense. We're here, aren't we? This town is here." Femi looked up at her, his face hollow, his eyes filled with something dark. "No," he shook his head. "We're not." A thick silence fell over them, the weight of Femi's words settling like a stone in their chests. Then, a soft sound. Footsteps, somewhere nearby. Slow, deliberate. Someone or something was approaching. Dara was the first to turn toward the gas station, and that's when she saw them. A figure stood near the entrance of the gas station. A woman. She was tall, unnaturally so, with long, wiry limbs that seemed too thin for her frame. Her skin was pale and stretched tight over her bones, as though she had been starved for years. And her eyes, black, just like the Femi thing. Her lips pulled into an unnatural smile, revealing jagged teeth. And she wasn't alone. Dara's breath caught in her throat as more figures stepped out from the shadows. Some of them were missing pieces, an arm, a chunk of flesh, half a face. Their eyes were all black voids, empty and endless. They stood still, watching, waiting. The woman took a step forward, then another. Then she ran, not like a human, not like anything that should exist. Her body jerked and convulsed as she sprinted toward the van, her limbs moving unnaturally fast, like a spider skittering across its web. Bang! She slammed into the side of the van, her face pressed against the window, her black eyes locking onto Dara's. Dara screamed. Tun didn't hesitate this time. He slammed the car into reverse, tires screeching as he pulled away from the gas station. But the figures, they were everywhere now, lining the streets, standing on porches, their heads tilting in perfect unison as they watched the van. Some of them were smiling. Tun swerved onto the main road, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "We have to get out of here," Oyen screamed. "I'm trying." Tun snapped, eyes darting between the road and the figures that had begun to move. Some were running, their inhuman bodies jerking and twisting as they chased after the van. Others simply stood still, watching as if waiting for something. Then, the road in front of them shifted. The buildings moved, like pieces of a puzzle being rearranged. The gas station they had just fled from was now directly ahead of them, as if they had never left. Tun's breathing came in sharp gasps. He spun the wheel, trying to turn the van around, but bang! The woman was back. She slammed into the windshield, her jagged teeth grinding together in a horrible, unnatural way. Her lips moved. Dara couldn't hear the words, but she could read them. "You should have prayed." Crack! The windshield splintered. Her hand burst through the glass. And then, everything went black. The darkness was suffocating. Dara felt like she was sinking, her body weightless yet crushed under an unseen force. The silence around her was absolute. No screams, no growling, no screeching tires. Just nothing. Then, a voice. Soft, distant, yet unmistakable. "Dara, wake up." Her eyes flew open. She was still in the van, but everything was wrong. The windshield was shattered, shards of glass embedded in the dashboard. The others were slumped in their seats, unconscious or worse. And outside, the town had changed. Alika was no longer a silent ghost town. It was alive, but not in the way it should have been. The streets were now full of people. Their movements were jerky, wrong, like marionettes on tangled strings. They walked in slow, unnatural steps, their black eyes devoid of emotion. A thick fog rolled through the town, swallowing the buildings, distorting the shapes. But the worst part? The woman was still there. She stood in front of the van watching, smiling. Her face was no longer human. It had begun to crack, deep fissures forming across her cheeks, revealing something beneath. Something dark, something ancient. Then she spoke. "You're not supposed to be here." Dara's heart pounded. She turned to the others, shaking Tun's shoulder. "Wake up! We have to go!" Tun groaned, his eyelids fluttering. Chioma and Malik stirred as well, their faces pale and drawn. But Femi was already awake, and he was staring straight ahead. His lips were moving, but no sound came out. His fingers dug into the seat, his knuckles white. Then, barely above a whisper, "She's coming." The woman moved, not with a step, but a flicker, like a shadow shifting against firelight. One moment she was outside. The next, she was inside the van. Dara screamed. The woman loomed over them, her head tilting at an unnatural angle. Her mouth stretched wider than it should have, jagged teeth glistening with something dark. "You have wandered where the dead do not sleep," she whispered. Then, her hand shot forward. Femi was yanked from his seat, his body dragged out of the van. "No!" Dara lunged forward, grabbing for him, but it was too late. The townspeople, the marionettes, were waiting. They reached for Femi, their hands clawing at his skin, pulling him into their midst. And then, he vanished, swallowed by the fog. Gone. Tun wasted no time. He slammed his foot onto the gas, the van lurching forward, plowing through the shifting figures. The tires skidded, the vehicle jerking wildly as he fought to keep control. The town blurred around them, twisting and warping like a living nightmare. Buildings moved, roads vanished, and the fog thickened. The town was trying to keep them. But then, a break in the mist, a single road, straight, endless, and ahead, the same rusted sign they had seen before. Alika, 3 kilometers. But this time, something was different. The letters were fading, disappearing, as if the town itself was being erased. Dara clutched Oyun's hand, her heart hammering. "Pray," she screamed. And for the first time, they all did. Their voices rose together, shaking, desperate. They called out to God, their ancestors, anything that would listen. They prayed for salvation. They prayed for Femi. And as the final words left their lips, the fog broke. The road ahead was clear. The town of Alika was gone, and behind them, nothing but forest, as if Alika had never existed. The sun was rising when they finally stopped. No one spoke. No one cried. They simply breathed. It was over. Except it wasn't, because Femi was still gone, and none of them could shake the feeling that somewhere, in a place that shouldn't exist, he was still screaming, still trapped, still praying to be found. But no one ever would, because Alika was not a place you escaped. It was a place you were taken, and those who entered it never truly left.